Connor Fowler, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for coming on and lending your time here. I'm excited to go into things, all things branding, identity, and so on, and definitely a couple of the cooler projects that you've worked on. And I'm going to, by the end of this, hopefully convince you to allow me to work with you as well. I'm gonna that's my little side project for the show as well, is to be like, Connor, please
Just
take
gonna
me on as
keep
a client.
chipping away at this until I'm broken. That's the idea, right? Yeah.
Exactly, mate.
It's going to
Exactly.
be that,
But
or you're going to make me
you're
take
in.
an N out of my name. That's going to be the thing, isn't it?
I think we're gonna have to get you just to be more and more Irish over time. Like, we're just that's the only option. But you have a very interesting kind of, I suppose, place carved out in terms of kind of what you post about online, the kind of clients that you've worked with, and the kind of branding identities that you've built. But before we go into that and all of the very interesting people you've worked with and projects you've worked on, where did it all start with you getting into design and getting to sort of where you are
So
today?
yeah, my a lot of my story is it's really funny actually, because a lot of it is documented online in various formats. Many of them really kind of not making me look great now. Not from a I'm a horrible person, from a oh my god that's kind of cringe kind of way. But where do we start? So the main kind of pivot point for me was when I was in college, so end of high school, for any of your US listeners, age 16, 17, and my biology teacher said to me, well, first she slammed a ruler down on the bench because I'd fallen asleep in the lesson, and then proceeded to yell and berate me because you're a teenager and you want to sleep. And instead of providing a nurturing educational environment, her line was, "You don't need to know this or understand it. You just need to memorize it." At which point I'd checked out. Um, Up to that point, I'd been dabbling in like music and other stuff, and I'd had a band for a couple years. I'd done art GCSE, but never really touched anything related to design. And that moment allowed me to check out of formal education. And then instead of going to lessons, what I did was I spent every free period that I had, and many lessons, just skipped them entirely, to go to the library and learn how to use Adobe Illustrator, which is the industry standard, I would guess you'd call it, of vector design software, which then allowed me to make T-shirts and CD designs and things like that for the band that I was in at the time, and a couple of logos here and there, but mainly just spending hundreds of hours instead of coursework, instead of going to lessons, instead of doing whatever else I was meant to be doing at that time. I used that period to develop design skills instead. Ended up going into screen printing instead of going to university, because I remember looking at UCAS, which is the application software in the UK. I don't know if you guys have that. I think you must have had UCAS as well, right?
We have our
Or
own.
similar.
We have like the CAO, but a lot of people would apply to
Yeah, okay.
UCAS as well.
But it's basically an encyclopedia of tens of thousands of courses with very vague descriptions and locations. And I, again, saw that on top of it and was like, there's no way I can deal with that. You're being crushed by the weight of coursework at 17 and you're asking me to decide the next 5 years of my life. It's not happening. So again, instead, doubled down on the route I was going, told all my teachers to politely F off, and left college, and went straight into being an apprentice screen printer, because I thought that that's going to keep me going towards the music industry. That's going to keep me going towards being around the music industry, even if I'm not able or don't hit gold with being in a band. It allowed me to scale into that world. And then as time went on, I figured out that actually people need the most help at the lower levels, further backwards in the process. So you then go from the printing of the t-shirts to the designing of the t-shirts to the designing of the brand, and you can see how that steps back all the way to where I am now, in more of a foundational identity, and consulting strategic position.
Gotcha. So you were playing music as well. What kind of band were you in at the
I
time?
was in a melodic hardcore band and like a Enter Shikari electronic rock band for a while as well.
Sick, man. So always
Mm-hmm.
creative kind of elements coming through there. Was this from obviously the interest in design wouldn't have just started right then when you were 16, 17. I'm sure if that was okay, I don't want to be doing like biology, maths, all of these other subjects necessarily. I want to be doing something more creative. Was design something that you like picked up from a young age? Did you enjoy even like art when you were
Yeah, so
younger? Like where did
I
the kind
I
of
did art
interest in?
GCSE and I was doing art subject for a long time, but I was never particularly good at traditional art. So in obviously formal education, art is a very specific thing, and it's generally bound to whoever is grading your work at the time. So when I did art GCSE, I did drama. I didn't do music because I couldn't read music, which is also hilarious. But I'd done stuff in and around this for most of my life has been a blend of creative process and academic. But when I was 16 through 18, that's when I figured out actually academic subjects were not for me unless I was actually curious about them. And the energy I had flowed much more smoothly and efficiently when blending it with a creative output. Um, which is why many of the clients I have now say that I'm a perfect blend between design and the business side because I can see both angles, and that's basically what I've straddled for most of my like adult life and teenage years as well, is blending the understanding of the world and that subject. So understanding how to get my band booked at gigs, how to reach out and cold email promoters. Yes, I was doing that at 13. Screw you, money Twitter. Um, 14, but we'll take it. And generally trying to hit both angles is the way I've always behaved, whether or not I actually knew what that meant until I was 25. Not really. But the through line has always been there.
Gotcha. So this process of kind of moving up the chain
Mm-hmm.
somewhat, right? Or I suppose not so much up the chain, but like moving
No,
backwards in the
up the chain's a
process.
good way to
So
put it. Yeah.
okay, okay, up the chain as well is a good way to put it as well. So we have okay, you have let's say doing specific implementation of like doing the screen printing. Okay, but then there's like the actual prints themselves, and this is almost in a sense moving up in terms of leverage as well. It really is actually. So then you're moving up in terms of the designing the prints, let's say, but then designing the whole brand and aesthetic for the brand, and like we're kind of looking at like positioning matters obviously so much. It's like this headwind within everything. So within an identity, okay, so you have the specific aspects of your content or whatever it is that you're doing. You have like, I don't know, hook, body, call to action, all these things. Oftentimes those are actually fine. It's that people aren't positioned as someone
Mm.
worth listening to in a sense. So you're giving you like move to like give someone more and more leverage in their process. How does this sort of begin then from this period where you kind of you lean into more design, you're going down the path of screen printing? How did you go about like, moving up the chain from there? What were the realizations that went on in that process?
There's no 2020 hindsight. Here's the book. Here's the steps. It's the easy way to put it is to say like I had an epiphany. I smoked a ton of weed at the beach and I saw things. No. What happened was I detested my boss and he was paying me basically less than minimum wage. I decided that actually I really like designing logos and that's what I was doing in my spare time. And I'm going to quit the job that's treating me like crap and I'm going to get a part-time job at Lidl and I'm going to spend every other hour brute forcing my way through Instagram in 2017 when there's no carousels, no Instagram stories, hashtags barely even worked then, and just brute force it. Just post content relentlessly until someone pays attention. I'd tried applying for design jobs, um, and unfortunately, you end up in, or I don't know whether this is still the case now, the world's probably moved on, but at the time I was applying for design jobs, junior positions, design jobs at like print shops and print houses. Um, the way to get in was you either have a degree or you don't. And if you check the box of no, I don't have a design degree, it goes straight in the bin. So, despite being told by numerous employers in the interviews that my portfolio is too good, yeah, or not quite what we're looking for because it was largely branding focused rather than print focused, because I didn't know what I was doing. Um, I just decided I'd brute force it, as I have done with most of the things I found success with. Um, it's not been sit down and manifest my way there. It's been, how do I run very quickly away from things I hate, and how many things and how many punching bags do I have to hit till I can get what I want, pretty much.
How does this then transition to? Did you then go down the self employment
That's what I
route,
did
like you're building up
immediately.
your
So
Instagram?
I had 6 months of savings and some parents who were willing to not let me live under their roof for free, but for significantly less than the rent of the local area. And they said, go for it. Um, and it was not a process I would recommend to anybody, because it was miserable for 6 months. It was such a grind, with, especially back in like 2017, there were so few resources on how to build a social media presence that wasn't simply grifting. Um, of the few people I recognize who were actually producing great content around building a business at the time, it was like on the edges. So it would be like some gaming YouTuber who's blown up and then has one tiny bit in a 50-minute video of like, oh yeah, here's the structure of how I built my business. It was so few and far between. And yes, of course, you could say like, oh, Tony Robbins and all these people have been around forever writing books on this stuff. You could have found those resources, but it was never something I was exposed to as someone who came from a creative music background. I was tangentially aware of that world and able to recognize the pieces of like how a system is built, how a business is built, but to actually understand the execution points, no idea. So instead, I was just brute forcing it. I was like, right, well, I know that the internet exists. I know that people are being hired through their own websites and through social media. So I'm just going to keep posting on social media until someone pays attention. And I was doing it on Instagram and Dribble and stuff like that. Um, I think that answers your question, but I'm also rambling.
No, but no, it's really good context. I mean, so this is a question that I had, right? Because I think sometimes people think that Naval says, learn how to build, learn how to sell, and if you can do both, you'll be unstoppable, that sort of thing. And then you have this creative element of things, but then running a business is highly, at least past the point, it's very
Mhm.
operationally complex. It's very rare to get someone who's very creative, and someone who can operate as well. It's very few people. Like Elon Musk is maybe one of the only people who can do that, like the highest level. Maybe there's some other people as well that I can't particularly think of. I know that's not mean to compare it to Elon Musk necessarily, put all that weight on you necessarily, but this idea of it's hard to find someone who's creative and is also going to be able to operate a business. So like for you in the beginning, was it a very tough learning curve of you going from being a creator and a creative person to then now you have to run a business? Now you're doing things like, okay, we have to get clients. I need to learn a sales process. I need to make sure that I have contracts with people and invoices and all this kind of thing. And then I'm communicating with them on a certain cadence. And then we have certain deliverables that we need to meet. And it's all a bit rigid.
Yeah.
What was that process like,
So
learning the business side
fortunately,
of it?
I've grown up in a family that has had entrepreneurs in the past. So my grandfather on my dad's side ran a very large, ran a substantial roofing company in Nottingham. And my dad grew up around that, obviously. It was the family business. And whilst my dad isn't an entrepreneurial, he is an engineer. So he's picked up a significant amount of that. And then obviously I've picked that up by proxy. And my mum is the creative side. So it was not as painful as you might initially think, but it's finding the specifics. It's not the implementation so much for me, it's the specifics of what will be effective. Um, so things like contracts, you can go on Google and be like logo design contract example. And I think a lot of the initial skills that people, myself included, struggle with is, what is the keyword? Yeah. What is the word I know how to use the software. I know how to find information on the internet, but what is the specific keyword I'm looking for? Okay, here's a great example. I was looking for a treadmill to go under my desk. You would think that is an under desk treadmill or a desk treadmill. Yeah. It's not. It's called a walking pad. Why?
Why?
Fuck knows. Okay. But I spent 3 months trying to find this thing because I just every like in between meetings being like, I just want one of these. What's it called? And that's the cycle that I think people get stuck in. So, and myself included at times. So when it came to doing things like figuring out invoicing, figuring out a good cadence, do I use Slack? Do I use Discord? Do I just use email? My main kind of protocols that I would always use are what has worked basically forever and just use that. I still send out PDF invoices. I still send out PDF contracts. Yeah, I don't use DocuSign. Yeah, I don't pay $40 to have someone sign a PDF. Yeah, I use as few tools as I physically can. I don't use Slack. Like the only people who have my number on WhatsApp are people like Chris Williamson. Yeah, and that's mostly to send each other memes. Like it's not to do business. Yeah, so I'm pretty old school when it comes to this type of stuff because of the amount of noise it can produce. Because as you're talking about balancing the strategic systems businessy side with the creative side, every ounce of noise that I add to the businessy side, like almost triply impacts the creative side. It just compounds the noise that goes through to the other side of the system, which is something I'm learning in more recent years. But very early on, it would just bog me down. So you would, is this the right language to use in a contract? I didn't have GPT to be like, hey, read this PDF. What would you change? Yeah.
This is true. Yeah, I mean, noise reduction is definitely key there. I mean, especially for a creative type, like, and it, bro, it almost like creates this like kind of thinking about task. What was it, Seneca or something like that? It was like it's thinking about the task that tortures people rather than doing the task. Something to that degree. It's like when you have a Slack channel waiting for you with like 50 different messages. Like even now when we get off this, I'm gonna be like, I'm gonna come back and just get my brain's just gonna get absolutely fisted by a load of notifications when I start checking everything again. I mean, what else is changing there? Was it smooth sailing from the beginning for you jumping into things? Did you get some pretty raw clients who are disrespectful? A lot of things you have to learn. What was the early process like for you to
leading
learn?
on from the 6 months of savings in the bank account to kind of fisting my way through Instagram, just to use the language you were using, it became very tricky to maintain, as all things with consistency, especially when you're deriving such self-importance and self-worth based on likes and follows and all this type of stuff. And also when people in the industry around you, at the very early days, I had a handful of people basically try and kick me when I'm down multiple times. As someone who was very new to the industry, and basically I came in with my dual pistols with my cowboy hat and just firing out like pew, 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 yeah, and just making loads of noise. They didn't like that at all. So there was a big kind of like, the process I have was working. It was bringing in some people, but I had no idea how to value myself. I had no idea what the skill set was I actually needed other than make the creative thing. Because most of design, in my opinion, especially around identity, it's like 85% strategy, pre-work, creative direction, and then the actual making of the assets. Because, and this is something I've got significantly better at over the years, is it's much easier to get it right first time than it is to present like 10 things and hope something sticks. Yeah. And in those early days, that's all I was doing. There was like no boundaries on revisions. There was no boundaries on paying anything. It was like, you can pay up front if you want, or pay 50-50, or pay at the end, or whatever. And I just burned myself out consistently. So every single time I'd get a new project in, it would just burn me out. You get to the end of it and go, wow, this is amazing. Oh my God, them just being torn apart. Yeah. And it probably took, 2017, it probably took at least 2.5 years, maybe nearly 3 years, and probably about 3 bouts of really bad depression to figure out what my process was, what types of people I like working with, and what structure I have to put in place to make sure that I don't get royally fucked every single time I work with a client. Yeah. And that's not to say it was always their fault, because it's all my responsibility. And that's how I look on it now, is like, every decision I made here to not set boundaries in place, to say this instead of that, is my responsibility. And that's why I take on so few clients now. And that's why I am so exclusive with who I work with, is not because I desire less work, because that's not true. It's because I value the time and the output that I have, and the capacity that I have to produce that quality of output. Because if I doubled the amount of clients I'm taking on at the moment, the only way to achieve that would be to double the size of the team, which is currently just me. Yeah. So you would easily go to 2, 4, 5, 6 people, and probably double all the headaches and half my capacity for producing great work. So it has not been smooth sailing for most of it. And I would challenge almost any, I don't like using the word freelance, but if that's where you're starting, that's how I started, and that's what I would call myself to begin with, was freelance. I would challenge anyone who's touting anything different than that. It's a slog. Like, it really is. Even with 6 months of savings in the account, that was barely enough to scratch me by, if I'm honest.
Yeah. How did the projects change from there? So like projects you'd have began working with, was it always brand identity for people? Were there lots of different bits and bobs going around the place? How did the style of project evolve?
The core
over
has
time?
always been identity. So for those people who may not know what I mean by a brand identity, it's generally the things that form the foundation of the visual components of a brand. Or company, for that matter, or a personal brand, or whatever. So in the context of a personal brand, if you think about this as a pyramid shape, at the top of the pyramid, you're generally going to have whoever the host is. So Chris Williams is a really easy example. You would say his face would be top of that identity. And then everything else under it would be things like his color palette, the typeface they use, the YouTube thumbnails they use are part of the identity, the name Modern Wisdom, the podcast artwork, all the visual graphics that attach itself to either that person's body of work or a company's body of work. Nike, obviously, you've got the swoosh, but you also have all their different typefaces. You have the way they use photography, the particular taglines they have. These are all part of their identity. Yeah. And these are things that are built up generally from a singular foundational system and then iterated on depending on the kind of output or execution. So whether it's a social output, you might probably want to use video animation. Video animation might not be part of the identity, but it's something that is built from that initial system. So did it always start with identity? The identity projects, that's what I've always been interested in, is symbols, messaging, and generally the refinement of, or focal point of, a entity that someone's interested in. So that doesn't just have to be a brand or a corporation or an individual. It's also things like religion, like Christianity. It's like, why is the cross such a potent symbol? Yeah. So that's what got me most interested, is how people condense all this information down into something that can easily be drawn by a child, effectively. Yeah. So that's where it all started, is largely with logo design. And I then expanded it out into doing basic identities. But then over time, it has broadened into doing things like packaging. So I've done one of my first bigger clients was quite a big Etsy brand that did etched glassware. So I had to design not just an identity that fit their product and could be etched into glassware, but it was also the packaging that goes along with it. And they're still using all of that today. And that's 4 or 5 years on, which is amazing to see, because when you land it correctly, it sticks around. Yeah. So it has kind of ebbed and flowed, to answer your question. It's gone from the basics, which is usually logo type color palettes, like it's that kind of trifecta, all the way out to working on brand strategy and packaging and all these other like assets, business cards, letterheads, the classic type stuff. And I've actually started to taper that back in now. So I've never done things like website design. I know how to make a good website. I just don't do it. I know how to find someone who makes a great website. I just don't do it. Yeah. So I've really focused in now on those three areas and the creative consulting and brand consulting behind it. So that when we build that block of visual assets, that visual system, it lasts. And that another designer or someone else, let's say you have someone who makes Instagram carousels for you every single day. I'm not going to do that for you. Yeah, because I don't really enjoy doing that, if we're being frank. And my skill set is not in developing an asset that is made every single day. You wouldn't like to see the bill for that, I would assume. But I mostly enjoy and find myself to be most effective taking people's core essence, message, values, and developing that into a system that is recognizable, direct, appropriate, and then letting other people in the team take those assets and run. Yeah, rather than trying to make something like a super rigid box, you give them the toolkit and let them run. And that's how you get something like Nike over the course of 20, 30 years, is by giving someone a foundation, which is what I do, and then blowing it out from there. But again, to come back to your question, it's ebbed and flowed. And I've tried a lot of things. Packaging is obviously a big one. Like I built a giant library of assets for that company. And afterwards I was like, I am never doing packaging ever again. Yeah. So, but you have to try it. And I'm sure you're the same with your work.
100%. Yeah. And there's this like thing with any sort of client work where like you're kind of touching on there. You just start with kind of one thing and it kind of develops on a bit more from there. Like your core, or you start with logo design, and then it's kind of this like progressive journey of like learning more bits to like finish out something that's higher leverage, if that makes sense. We keep talking about this bloody concept, but it's just that idea of you start with like this thing that you're initially interested in, of like just of designing logos, and you start to design more and more things, and then you kind of start to put this into something that's like codified, like a package where you're like, oh, this is like a pretty satisfying project now where I'm like fully finishing something out for someone, and they would actually pay me quite a bit for this because it's very valuable to them. And it's like this funny thing of like you just began doing stuff freelance, like maybe not having an idea of like what the projects you would do were. Like you kind of just start off doing something small, and then you're like, oh, and I like this, and I like this, and I like this, and this is valuable, and you sort of connect them all. Like, you know, like I started off doing sales, like freelance for agencies, and I was like, oh, like, this is decent. I like certain aspects of this. Met my business partner, obviously. He liked operating businesses and doing data science and all that kind of stuff that I fucking hate doing. And then the kind of mix goes out together. We're like, oh, we could probably run a company and it would probably work pretty well, because like I could probably get clients and then you could probably make sure we don't lose them. And that's like, it's like this spiral. Like you kind of have to just, it's like if you were like my friend, another Irish chap always says to me, he's like, you can drive from Cork to Belfast with your light's only going 10 meters in front of you or 10 yards in front of you, whatever it is. He's like, you just like keep putting one foot in front of the other, keep going that way. You don't need to know the exact route there. It's like if you have the lights on 10 yards in front of you, you'll be able to drive the whole way there. And kind of there, like you're saying, you start off with something small and then suddenly someone's like, can you do this? You try it. You're like, oh, I didn't like this, but I did enjoy this. And you start to bring it into like a service that you can actually do, and it's something that's super valuable for people. But I feel like they're going from creator to running your own business. It's like you kind of have to, there is an element of that. It's not like hubris, but there's an element of kind of having to trust yourself a wee bit and say, look, I could fall completely flat on my face here, like anyone who's going to start something of their own accord. But it's like you kind of, you're never going to really have the whole map laid out in front of you when you're starting something. It's kind of, there is an element of fucking hope and pray and see if something sort of begins to make sense, and if you can connect the dots looking backward a bit more. So it's a kind of a similar pattern that I notice in many places, where you start to tack on more things, and then you're able to it starts to make sense to you looking back. You're like, oh, I could actually do something a bit different here.
You could also do less. That's something as well, is that your point of driving from Cork to Belfast. I recently literally did this, not Cork to Belfast, but when I was in Madeira recently, we took a hire car to try and see the sunrise at, it's Pico di Aria or something like that. I can't, it's a very a difficult word for me to pronounce, but it's basically the highest point in Madeira. And we went in the hire car. It was like 5 a.m. Go and drive. Like, it's going to be hopefully a clear day. The weather says it's going to be really nice. Going to drive to the top of this mountain and watch the sunrise. Get in the car, leave the shoreline where it's obviously nice and clear. It's still dark. Get about 15 minutes into the mountains, and I can see 10 foot in front of me. And you're driving up mountainous roads with little to no barriers on both sides and 50+ foot drops. Okay, so, but you're totally right. It's doing less. Drop it first gear, really slow it to a crawl, and really pay attention to what you're doing. And it's the same thing that I've found over the last few years, is that you don't notice these things that you're doing too much of until it's either too late and you burn yourself out, or until you finished them. And only then can you look backwards and say, actually, okay, my friend was right. If I just take one step at a time and then assess it when I arrive, I will know a better way home or a better way to do it next time. Because there's nothing wrong. And many designers, I remember there was a big in like 2019, 2020 of like, all designers should know how to code. All designers should learn how to build websites. And I'm looking at like Webflow coming out, and I'm like, that's an easy no-code tool. I'm looking at looking at Semplice, which is another WordPress no-code buildery type tool. I'm like, AI is going to come along pretty soon, I bet. Why would I bother learning to code? And then, so in some ways, my stubbornness has prevented me from trying and experimenting with new things. But now all those people who offered those types of web services, they can either expand that capacity and build out an agency, and maybe they make more money than I do because of that varied skill set. Or maybe, as I've found, a significant amount of those people are just burnt out because they don't know what they offer. They do so many things that they don't really care about. And they're just trying to appease every single angle of what they believe a client wants or needs, rather than actually fulfilling something to a degree that is completely distinct in the market. Yeah, so rather than trying to produce the most valuable, most precise, most distinct, most appropriate asset for a client, they just do bits and pieces of everything, which, in my opinion, makes you look less valuable to a client, even if you bill them more in the invoice.
Very good way of putting it. A very important distinction to make, I feel, as well. So I'm interested to hear of like the process as well, right? So let's say you're working with someone. Let's say you take me, right? This is part of me now. Yeah, this is me trying to convince you to work with me now. So, I mean, what are pitfalls for someone to avoid? Like, if someone's making a brand identity, how do you ensure that is cohesive? And especially, like, let's say you take some of the characters you've worked with. You worked with Chris Williamson, of course, Alex O'Connor, Cosmic Skeptic. You work with Jordan Peterson's team. These people all talk about a wide range of topics. It's not like you're working with someone there who is, I don't know, talking about one very siloed thing. These people talk about vast range of topics, all very intelligent individuals. And it's like making a brand identity for, let's say, a Jordan Peterson, for example, is quite difficult because he talks about a wide range of things. I guess he has his maybe core couple of topics, which might make him easier. But Chris Williamson would be a difficult one because he talks about a wide range of topics. And a lot of them are almost quite contrasting, like very contrasting. He'll talk about Sam Sulek in one clip, and then he'll be talking about the evolutionary psychology of incest or something in another clip. Like, it's literally like really, really broad. It's like Jim Bro plus probably like academic evolutionary psychology knowledge as well. So and many other things as well into the bargain that seem quite contrasting. So how does someone make a cohesive brand identity for themselves that gets taken seriously, that is distinctive, that stands out? How do you even go about that process for unique characters when you're
firstly,
working with them?
It's really interesting that Sam Sulek and incest are the two topics that you pulled out from that. Really shows your taste in content. The way I always do this is by spending as much time not designing as possible and spending as much time with that person as I can. So Chris, for example, we started working together during the first lockdowns. And that was back when his thumbnails were still kind of scattered. Some of them were photographic, some of them were illustrations, some of them were red, some of them were bluish, some of them were kind of gray and white. Like, it was all over the place. And something that I have found throughout my life to be a really strong trait and skill set of mine is, as I mentioned earlier about logos, the ability to look at a very broad narrative or a very broad landscape and condense it down very quickly. So I'm pretty good at walking into a room with someone or having discussions on Zoom or going through a series of strategic prompts and figuring out what the through lines are. So generally, if, let's say, someone listening, you are producing video content, you are doing a podcast, you're posting content on Twitter, maybe you're doing Instagram content of some form or Reels. The way people recognize you as an individual is through your voice, your stories, as you've mentioned, the things you're interested in, topics that you consistently cover, but it's also the visual components. But how do we get to the visual components? You have to understand, as you mentioned, what makes that person different before you can do the alchemy part and turn it into graphic design. And generally the way I do that is by sitting down with someone and going through a variety of prompts and kind of a brand strategy type workshop. It's not like a traditional brand strategy workshop because I don't do things like competitor analysis for personal brands because the internet is such a massive place. It just seems foolish to try and fight over a particular plot of land on the internet. And it's never served me or my clients to do so. So any designers listening, if you think I'm being stupid, well, I have the track record of not doing it. There's an art to listening to people talk about themselves and prompting them in a way that pulls out that information you need to understand their voice, to understand the characteristics of their personality, their message, their goals, their vision. And generally that looks like, if they have an audience, this is easier. But if you're starting with a small audience or no audience, you need to think about and prompt the person you're working with to think about who their audience will be in the future. Yeah. And that's not to say you use audience capture is the negative side of that. You don't rely on the audience. You don't just give them what they want constantly. You still have to remain true to yourself if that's the route you want to go. If you want to be fully commercial and work on Disney Channel, then sell your soul, whatever, fine. But if you want to do this in a way that is for you, as an extension of you, and then you want to provide value to other people through education or entertainment, whatever, you need to figure out what they would be interested in and what they would use to describe you. So what keywords would they use to describe you? So Chris is an interesting one. They would use articulate to describe him. They would use fun, honest. You could use the word bold. Just you thinking of words at the top of my head. Bold is not a great one because it's just really not very specific. Heterodox is actually one of the words we used for his brand guidelines. So if you flick through those, you can see that word keeps coming up time and time and time again. And with his particular type of content, initially with the data that we had, we could see his audience was mostly interested in his stories through fitness, psychology, and him expanding the curiosity that he has into topics that otherwise don't get touched. So that's a big part of it, of really understanding someone's story, their voice, and why their audience would care or what their audience would say about them.
How long does that process take to even draw that out of someone over?
It really depends.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a year. That sounds, to me, I think, okay, that sounds like a lot of time because it's like Leon even talks about it. That sounds like an emergence, right? It's not something where it's not like you're going to depose them in an interview, be like, bang, 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 bang. It's not like you have this checklist. It's kind of this, it has to just spring
So there
forth.
is a framework that I use. There's a framework called Core, which is produced originally by Jose Cabala, I believe is how you say his surname, who was the previous business partner of my mentor, Chris Doe. and I use his framework as a baseline, but he uses it largely for startups, so I've stripped out a ton of it and replaced it with other things. But you use a specific framework to provide the prompts. And you're right, if I was just to sit and shadow someone and just see how they behave in their production, or when Chris goes to the set to record, like what's he saying to people? Like, you can listen to hundreds of hours worth of podcasts as well, and that does help. There is a lot of that research required, but I find the best way to draw that information out is under pressure. So we know each other fairly well, but people who I'm longtime friends with know that I'm particularly blunt. I'm not someone who's going to beat around the bush, but my clients have also, after we've done these sessions, said that was like therapy. Yeah, so it's this weird back and forth of knowing when to put the pressure on and when to let it go and say, okay, well, you're telling me all these things that sound very interesting, and they're getting all passionate and interested and like, oh, this sounds amazing. And in the back of my mind, I'm going, none of this is actually unique. None of this is particularly interesting. And sometimes the answer is, well, why should anyone give a shit? And it's like, you've just thrown them off the cliff. But if you give them the space and give people the space to actually take in that type of question, they spend a moment to figure it out. Yeah, because no one's actually chucked them out the plane before. Yeah, very few people have done the internal work to understand this. So when I worked with Alex O'Connor, for example, Cosmic, or formerly known as, we can use that, formerly known as Cosmic Skeptic, he's a very articulate person. Yeah, and he's a great formal debater. Yeah, working with him was a much more agonizing process from my side than from his side, because his ability to use language is significantly better than mine. Yeah, so when we were going back and forth, it was like, right, well, I'm literally Googling some of these words you're saying, but he had done the internal work. Yeah, I believe his degree was in philosophy. So like, it's not unlike that type of person to know who they are. Like, they will have done the work, and you'd be surprised if they hadn't. But for most people, you have to pat them on the back and say, well done, but you also have to throw them out the plane occasionally.
I can imagine you working with Alex O'Connor there, and he just pulling Jedi moves with the language, almost evading your questions a little bit there, and you're like, oh my god, this. And he can be at times a somewhat cantankerous individual. I'm sure that's potentially a word he's used at some point as well. He could be somewhat difficult.
I mean,
to
that's
work
how
with,
people describe me. So
but...
I'm not opposed to working with people like that.
Yeah, I mean, what would you say? Not so much the most enjoyable, but what would be the most standout in terms of the process for you, where you were like, that was particularly rewarding or particularly notable in hindsight?
Some of the very early recordings I have with Chris and with Dean, so with Video Guy Dean, because he was on all those calls as well, because at the time it was literally just Chris and Dean. Hearing those two argue amongst themselves and debate amongst themselves, while I've thrown the stake in the ring, and now we have two lions trying to fight over who gets the biggest piece. Yeah, you've got Chris, the guy who started the show, and you have Dean, who is the only other person who's worked on it up to this point. Watching those moments unfold and then seeing how things have developed is I'm very grateful that I was part of those moments, even if I was just the facilitator, just to sit back and be like, right, well, see where this goes. That's one of those particular moments. And then seeing from that work to now Chris going out and doing live speaking tours with sold out venues and graphics based on the system that I designed all those years ago is very rewarding. And I think generally I find these moments of discussion and debate, and at times literally arguing over color palettes, and why this particular color actually reflects the voice we're going for rather than just your favorite color. Um, and little nuances like that. When you actually see them play out in the world, that's when it becomes most exciting and real. Yeah, because brand is something that takes so long to build that it's not a case of running some ads on Facebook and being like, well, what gives me the best click through rate? What gives me the best return? It's you have to set it and use it and just forget about it in many ways. You have to be like, right, these are the limitations, these are blinders. We trust that Connor has built a system that is reflective of myself, my content, the audience we're trying to capture, and generally the vision that we have for the brand or the company. And we have to run it. There's no other way to get around it. You can't skip any of those steps. You have to put in the hard work. So it's something that I love doing in the moment, but I also love waking up 3, 4, 5 years later and getting an email from that person just because I'm on their newsletter and being like, I can't believe that. Are they really doing that? Like, we were on Zoom calls. Like, with Chris, for example, he was on crutches during our first ever meeting after he'd torn his ACL or something like that, his Achilles. Hopping around his kitchen while I'm presenting an audit for his current brand and being like, this is how we need to fix this. So it's been a long time, and the fruit of that work doesn't show immediately. And that's something that anyone who is listening to this, if you are building one of these types of platforms or brands or YouTube channels or podcasts, you have to remember that. Yeah, I'm someone where my entire job is setting up systems that should last, hopefully, for as long as that person exists out in the world. That's the goal. If it lasts for 10 years, amazing. If it lasts for 20 or 30, even better. And that's the horizons you have to use when thinking about the video that you put up every day. It's not the video, it's the vision overall. Yeah, it's the entire arc, because you can't spend so much time in the minutia of, well, this week I'm going to try this font, and then next week I'm going to try that font, and my logo's not quite right, I'm going to hire another guy on Fiverr. Just pick it. Just, if you don't have the budget to hire someone to help you, just pick a thing and do it and just run it. Yeah, and eventually you can hire me. Easy peasy.
Hey, can you send the invoice like right now potentially to me? Like just via email. Like,
Wise payment link incoming. Yeah.
Yeah, legit, man. No, hey, that is fascinating though, because they're like, yeah, you're thinking of that in just such a broad time horizon where it's sort of, you want this to last forever because it's actually kind of capturing the essence and the unchanging elements of a person. It's like capturing their core nature or their 7-year-old self.
Yeah.
Do you know?
The core message, the core voice. If you can summarize a person's voice in like 5 keywords, like how they sound to other people, and why other people like them, you go a significant amount of the way to building that system, because then you build a lens to see everything through and a filter to see everything through. And this is what I ended up when I was working with Jordan and his team when he was unwell, was being his brand manager. So being the final filter, being that point where you have to understand the person you are representing so well, nothing gets through the barrier that shouldn't. And it sounds really tough, and you see your face, but it's when you understand. Obviously, Jordan's had hundreds of hours worth of content at that point, so it wasn't too hard to figure that out with or without him. But when you're doing this for the first time, that's the reason I have the horizons that I do, and the long-term vision for the people I work with, and setting it in stone correctly now, is because you never know what's going to happen. Yeah. There are many people throughout history who, at this point, the people who are representing their legacy and their estate are doing it so poorly because they don't actually spend the time to understand the person they're trying to represent. Yeah. And it doesn't have to be forever. Things change, things adapt, people pivot. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with being a person who changes. But if you don't try and get it right the first time, I don't think you should bother. And that's not to be a perfectionist, but that's just to say, draw a line in the sand and then take that first step to Belfast.
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. What are the 2024 plans? You're working with a very select crop of clients really at any one time. You're not, so it's not this typical thing of, yeah, let's scale the arse out of it. It's just, it's working heavily on the basis of quality, and probably for you selecting the right clients as well, because that's a massive factor. Even that's what we're doing this year. Myself, and Connor G will always say that, with our agency, with any agency really, but particularly what we do, that we help Michael Jordan jump higher, and that's really the goal. You can look like a great coach if you're coaching Michael Jordan. It doesn't really matter what else comes into play there. But because I wouldn't say I'm a particularly great coach there, but for you selecting the right kind of clients and then being able to apply your magic to their brands, I'm sure is a big factor. But we're here in January 2024. What's the vision for the year?
Currently,
coming?
it's being fleshed out fully. That's why I spent 2 weeks driving up tiny, scary mountain roads, trying to unwind from the last year. But at the moment, I've spent so much time trying to figure out, like, I could scale this into an agency. The trend is to do productized agency. The trend is to do this. The trend is to try that. And for me, running an agency, whilst I could, and I am brand director, actually, I can't not mention Upfire Digital. I'm the brand director for one of, if not, in my opinion, the best podcast agency on the planet, Upfire Digital. Shameless plug, obviously. I'm their brand director for those clients. So I see how an agency is being built. Yeah. I've helped that agency in, I think, Eric Foster, the guy who actually has been doing it for 10 years, obviously has built the company. But in the last year, since we've all been working together and added new members to the team, it's skyrocketed and we're doing amazingly well. And I'd like to continue to see the success of that agency. Yeah. And as I say, I could very easily set up my own agency to do what I've been doing for people like Chris Williamson and Dakota Robertson and people like that. But I don't think it would provide the value that I currently provide to my clients. I think all it will do is extend the reach of what I do whilst reducing the quality, as I mentioned at the top of the show. Like, I don't see the time invested in hiring more designers to try and be like me to be worth the effort in the long run. I would rather tailor the clients I actually do take on, spend more time in a strategic consulting position, which is something that I'm hoping to open up. So if you've been interested by what I've said on the show today, you find me on Twitter and send me a DM. I'll be happy to talk about that type of consulting. That's what I'm hoping to do more of, because I think there's so many iterations people need to go through before reaching the point of a rebrand or reaching the point of setting up an identity system, that I want to be in those trenches with those people in the basement, like digging the holes. And then I want to come in at that high level and make sure everything's running smoothly. Yeah. So that's what I'm focusing on, is making sure that I can help people build those initial systems and then step away and look down and say, right, is this landscape performing as we'd expect? Rather than handing off a portion of my brain to a project manager who then runs a small team of designers. I wouldn't find it fulfilling. So for me, the plan for 2024 is to continue to help Upfire scale, because I am one of a handful of designers, because as I lead the entire department, it's my department, rather than just my agency. Like, it's one department within the agency. So scale that up as much as we can. And then on my personal side, spend as much time investing more time into the people that I think will be here in 10 years. Because that's another thing I didn't mention, is that I didn't, and I don't know if Chris will ever hear this, because I think I've actually told him face to face, but I picked him. I didn't just like fire off random stuff. I made a list of 20 or 30 different podcasters and I went, it's Chris. Chris is the one. Yeah. And then I relentlessly chased him until we worked together. So that is how the approach I'm taking with all my client work moving forward is, who do I think is going to be here in 5 to 10 years? Who do I think is going to become the absolute monster in their particular sector? And then doubling down on them, because that's how I think change is made in the world, is not always collectively, but it's often through individual shards, like really breaking through. So that's how I'm focusing it. I know that's kind of a split. I say I didn't want to build an agency, but I'm building an agency. Yeah. So it's focusing in on building a separate side and then doubling down on the clients that I really love working with.
Beautiful. One of them later this year, yeah, it's going to be, there could be someone who could be around, in 5 to 10 years. They could be closer to you than you even think. Like you could have maybe spoken to them at one point, but that's neither here nor there.
I mean,
yeah, 100%.
To your point on that,
it could be...
let's spend a moment. Hang on, let me just pull up because I think with the discussions we've had, you're heading in the right direction. Yeah, which is a lot to be said, like compared to most people who come into my DMs and they're like, "Oh, can you help me with this? Can you help me with that? Can you make me a logo?" It's like, no, you're a person who has actually put the time and effort in to understand the landscape and is really trying to head in the right direction, and that will get you most of the way there. The identity portion and the refining of those visual graphics and the refining of the editing style and the refining of the captions you put on reels or the music you use or whatever, that comes later, and it has to come later, because if you front load it, you just end up putting too many traps in place. So whenever you're like trying to publish a video, you're like, "Oh, I've stood in this bear trap, and I'm now, I've got to undo that, and then I've got to step in the next one," rather than just being like, "Here's the things we're trying. Try it for 6 months. Am I seeing growth? Okay, no, move on. Try something else." You have to be willing to treat it like a startup. Excuse me, burping on the show. You can edit it out. Thank you, Mr. Editor. You can treat it like a startup in the way that you are iterating consistently. Yeah. What you can't do is try and front load it and then just try and switch it up completely in 6 months. You're better off just iterating, really short feedback cycle, and then set a plan in place. And that's everyone I've worked with has done the same. To be polite, I don't work with people who are just getting started. And that's exactly for this reason. It's not just for my benefit. It's not like, oh, they're not going to have the budget. That is obviously part of it. But the major underlying reason is I can't actually produce the work that you need. Yeah, because I don't have something to work from. So whether it's Alex O'Connor or Jordan or Chris or any of the other people, amazing people I've worked with, they have all had an archive to work from. Yeah, they've all had something to start with. And when I look at what you're doing, I thoroughly enjoyed some of the clips you have up with James recently. You're heading in the right direction. Yeah, and it's pretty clear to me that the continuation of the path of tweak a tiny thing here or there, change that color. I still really like that font, so let's just keep using that font. And those minor tweaks will get you most of the way there. And then it's someone like me to come in and look at the overarching themes and say, this, pair all those together, and then run with that for like 5 years. So I don't see why we wouldn't in the future, but hopefully you understand why when you sent me that message a while ago, I was like, come back to me in 6 months. Yeah.
Yes, but I'm gonna take that as a success from what I said in the beginning of the chat. But yeah, Connor, like we were touching there, where can people find your stuff? Twitter is where you post quite, I would say, fairly frequently now. But there are other places people can pick up on your stuff. Where should people look if they want to?
So the best place to find me is at Fowler Design on Twitter. I'm sure Connor will be kind enough to put a link in the show notes or wherever that will be. ConnorFowler.com is my main website. You can just email me. You can email hello@ConnorFowler.com. If you cold sell me, I will block you, so don't do that. But overall, what I'm hoping to do this year, as I said, is take on more work from people that I think are going to be here for the long run. So if that sounds like you and you want to reach out, by all means, I'd love to hear from you. I am on Instagram and Dribbble and all the places that designers are, but the most active place will be Twitter. And it's been, thank you very much for inviting me on.
Thank you very much indeed for coming on, Connor. We're going to have everything down in the description. If you're on YouTube, it's going to be down in the description. If you're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever else on audio, will be in the show notes. Definitely connect with Connor. I highly vouch for the man. So yeah, Connor, thanks again. And I'm sure it won't be the last chat that we have.
Thank you.